Good morning, everyone on the call. Good morning, gentlemen. We have today three brilliant gentlemen here lined up to talk about what the implications are for the IMF program that was recently signed and agreed. This, as far as I know, is the first time we're having an open public forum online to discuss an IMF program in this region, and I am very grateful to the three participants here on the panel for making this happen. And I appreciate all of you who've made time to attend this webinar. As Melissa said, we will have a Q&A session afterwards, and so we're happy to entertain your questions. So let me first now go into the introductions. First, Bert van Selm, he is the Deputy Division Chief in the IMF's Caribbean 2 Division. He was the fund's resident representative in Jamaica from 2013 to 2016 and the IMF's mission chief for Belize 2016 to 2017. And he's currently the mission chief for Barbados. So that should tell you that Bert is used to dealing with these kinds of tricky situations and economic transformation and recovery programs. And by the way, I want to congratulate Bert for being able to skillfully get this program, Barbados Economic and Recovery and Transformation, BERT, having the same initials as him. That's fabulous. Congratulations for that, Bert. I also have Professor Avinash Persaud, who is Special Advisor to the Government of Barbados. And also, I want to use this opportunity to congratulate, for those of you who are not aware, to congratulate Prof's wife, Ingrid Persaud, who just won the BBC's short story competition after having won the Commonwealth short story competition. Her work is amazing. I can't wait to read whatever she writes, especially when Prof sends it at 5 a.m. That just makes it all the more exciting. So it's a pleasure to have Prof here. I mean, he's had experience advising G20 on the global financial crisis. He's also assisting the government of Dominica with their economic and social recovery as well. And so very well experienced and qualified to lead in this transformation in Barbados. And finally, but of course, by no means least, we have Juan Carlos from the IDB, who's been with the IDB for 19 years, been in Barbados for 2.5 years, and has also served in Mexico and Brazil. So it's a pleasure, gentlemen, to have all of you with me this morning. Thank you so much for taking your time and for being willing to respond to my questions and those of the audience. So we'll kick it off first by asking Bert, can you share with us, I saw that the IMF released their full staff report yesterday, of course, and so I encourage all of the attendees to have a look. It has a lot of good detail around the current economic situation and projections as well. But I will ask Bert to give us a synopsis of what this economic program is going to look like, what are the main targets, timelines, and outcomes that they're aiming to achieve in this program. Thanks. Bert, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Marla, for inviting me to participate in this this morning. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to do so. Yes, all the details are available online. The IMF's staff report was published just yesterday, 90 pages, so lots of detail there. But what I'll do here today is give you a bit of a big picture of what the purpose of this program is and why the IMF Executive Board approved it last Monday. The key objectives of the program are to restore macroeconomic stability, debt sustainability in Barbados, and to restore economic growth. Barbados, as everybody knows, of course, has had a very tough last 10 years with increasingly high public debt and increasingly lower reserves and also very low growth. And this is a trend that now needs to be reversed. The new government of Barbados that came in late May has a lot of plans to do this, and we are very happy to be able to be here to try to assist them with that, with our financial support, but also with our technical and policy advice. So we had intense discussions over the summer about how best to do that. Those discussions were quick and very fruitful, and they led to this program that we could announce this week, and that we will believe will also bring in other players like the IDB, who's with us here this morning, but the CDB also, who will then bring in their expertise and their financial firepower to help move this program forward. So what are the key elements of the program? I think there's three main pillars. One is the fiscal consolidation, one is the debt restructuring, and one is the structural policies to improve growth performance. So I'll very briefly say something about these three pillars. First, fiscal consolidation. Of course, critical to get out of a very high public debt situation is for the government to start running a tighter ship. In the context of the mini budget in June of this year, the government of Barbados announced that they aim to get to a primary surplus of 6% of GDP, not this fiscal year, but next fiscal year. With a combination of measures on both the revenue and the expenditure side. So we've looked at those measures carefully, and we think they look good. They make sense in the sense that they should make it possible to get that primary surplus to 6% of GDP. But they're also very important in improving the quality of fiscal policy, both on the revenue and on the expenditure side. On the revenue side, we liked a lot of what we saw in the mini budget, the rebalancing of taxes more towards people with higher incomes who can carry more of the burden, but also the rebalancing more towards non-residents, the tourism sector, to tax those a little bit more. That's good. On the expenditure side, what stands out in Barbados is really very high transfers to state-owned enterprises. They're high and they're growing, and they contain risks because the monitoring of state-owned enterprises leaves a lot to be deserved. So that, we think, has to be a focus of this reform program, and on that, I think we're fully aligned with the authorities of Barbados, who are also of that view. Then on debt, I mean, public debt is clearly unsustainable. In the last annual economic report that we did under the previous government, we said so loud and clear. 157% of GDP, we put that in our latest staff report, and this is very high by any standard. So to try to get that down, a debt restructuring of the existing stock of debt is very important. On this also, the new government of Barbados moved very, very fast. Already on June the 1st, they announced a comprehensive restructuring of its debt. So we support that. We think that was a good initiative. The discussions around that have been going also fairly fast. So as you know, the domestic part of the debt restructuring was already announced. Exchange offer was launched on September the 7th. And very importantly, what we thought, and we worked a lot with the authorities on that over the summer, is that it strikes the right balance. Because when you restructure your debt, you want to make sure that you have a meaningful debt restructuring that makes a real difference in public debt. But of course, it should not be so large as to jeopardize financial stability. So it's very important to find the right balance there, and we think the government of Barbados has done a very good job on that. So that's the domestic part of the debt restructuring. That's the bulk of the public debt, so that's also the most important part of it. External debt restructuring typically takes a little longer because you have more diverse holdership, different countries, different places, different types of instruments. That's also moving ahead, and is an important part, we think, also of the debt restructuring, but will happen a little later than the domestic debt restructuring, and will also be very important in addressing lumps in financing needs. Under the old profile, before the debt restructuring, there was a lot of amortization due in 2021 and 2022, which created uncertainties about how that was going to be financed. This should be addressed in the external debt restructuring, so that's also a positive. And then on the growth side, we believe that there are many things that can be done in Barbados that do not necessarily cost a lot of money, that make it easier to do business and to to start up something new, quicker clearance through customs, for example, quicker approval process for construction permits for doing something new. We're already feeling that something's changing on this under the new government. There's much more of an awareness that these things matter a lot, and there is a lot to be done to improve that. And that we will also try to support under the program with technical advice as necessary, perhaps also from other players, CDB, IDB, and also with clear benchmarks under the program, so that progress towards a better situation can be clearly monitored. And I think that's the essence of the program.
Thanks, Bert. You did mention about the debt to GDP at 157%. Is there any measure, does that include a raise, or is there an additional measure for a raise that you can share with us?
The staff report has a very clear breakdown, so rather than floating around with numbers here, it might be easier to refer to
just go to there. Yeah, I didn't get to that. I didn't get that far in.
But the arrears part in particular, we spent some time on that over the summer because the situation was unclear. It was clear that arrears were quite a bit higher than what had been reported under the previous government, but exactly how much higher, you also need to be careful with avoiding double counting and things like that. But I think we have that pretty much sorted now.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. And the reason I raised it too is because, I mean, I've noticed that that's something that perhaps is a growing trend and risk in this region, particularly with governments who are, having financial difficulty and not being able to balance their budget. They window dress the deficit by incurring arrears, and of course, it ultimately comes back to bite you. So that's something, as an observer and analyst, looking at fiscal numbers across the region, whenever you see the deficit coming down, you always have to wonder, is it really a true reduction in the deficit, or is it that they were racking up arrears? And in Trinidad, I wonder that as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and of course, a key part of the government to be a reliable partner is to do what it says it will do. No? So if it buys something, then it says it paid the bill, it will pay the bill. So a very important part of regaining credibility is also to pay off the existing stock of arrears. It's fairly large, so it's going to take some time to do that, a few years, but it is very important to do that, and we hope to help the government to do so under the program.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So, Prof, can you tell us from the government's perspective, what are your major targets and timeframes and goals under this program? Oh, I think Prof is muted.
Is that better?
Oh, yes, I'm hearing you now. We got you.
So I thought I should begin by just commenting a little bit about the last point you were making, Marla, about arrears, because we did find that in the last few years, Barbados was sort of running two budgets. We had the real budget and we had a shadow budget. We had about $1.2 billion of arrears accumulated over 3 to 4 years by central government. And then there were more arrears by other parts of the public sector. That number might have been as high as $1.9 billion. And we need to run our affairs in such a way that we're not running arrears. That when, as Bert said, when the government contracts you or when it asks you for your VAT and you deserve a refund, that you get that. And that requires making significant adjustments. But let me come now to your wider point, and listening to Bert's excellent summary of what we've been doing for the past 3 months reminded me that perhaps the most important word in the 5 words of the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan is transformation.
Yes.
And it's probably the least understood of the 5 words. So we need to transform our budgets, our fiscal approach, and our economy. But what does that mean? Because transformation is not an everyday word. And it's about making lives better. And what does that mean? It's about, because we don't want to make lives better just for one day or 1 week or even 5 years. It's making lives permanently better. And that means really allowing people to be masters of their fate, to be able to make real choices. Development is about your ability to choose the avenue that you want to follow and not have that chosen by someone else for you or chosen by the circumstances of your birth. And so we're trying to transform our economy to put people, individuals, communities back at the center where they can aspire to things and their choices are not constrained. And that sounds like a lot of lofty talk. What does that actually mean? Because we have indeed built a plan around that, because that means that when kids go to school, that this is a top school, not a sink school. It's a school where we have good teachers, and it's a school where they believe that through hard work and good teaching, they can be excellent around the world. Easy to say that, but we actually have ring-fenced in the Bert plan education expenditure. We have increased teachers' pay, and we've created a new category of a master teacher, who are some of the best teachers, so that they can progress their careers and livelihoods, not by moving out of teaching into administration, but by remaining a good teacher. So this is very important, that our kids leave school then confident and curious, and then they need to get a job, because at the end of the day, most learning actually takes place by doing, not in an institution. So we have a first jobs program that we were able to do within this program, which is about giving people real work experience. The experience of getting in the morning and turning up to work is more important than you can imagine. And Barbados has a particularly bad labor force participation, sort of jobs for people who are young. Our youth unemployment is extremely high. So we need to have a high skill, high wage economy. And for that to work, it's not just qualifications and learning by doing. They need to have the infrastructure that allows them, through broadband, for example, to reach out to the world, to show the world that they are there producing something, creating something of excellence. And so we need to invest in broadband. We're going to have free broadband in Bridgetown. We need to invest in our road system, in our airport and our seaports. And that money also had to be ring-fenced. So it's not just about cuts. It's about what you're spending on, being much more focused on future development and growth, and spending the money smartly and prioritizing that. And that vision of top school, first jobs, infrastructure, a government that facilitates investment and development and growth and isn't getting in the way. I live in mortal fear living in Barbados that I'm going to be bounced by some driver, fender bender, on the roundabout, because I'm going to have to wait there for the police to come through the traffic, and I'm going to miss all of my meetings with Bert and other people by this silly process we have. We need to modernize Barbados. We need to get rid of all these nuisances, and we need to have proper infrastructure. Now, we can't do any of that if people are living in fear of an imminent devaluation. Right. If our credit rating is at the lowest rate you can imagine, on par with Venezuela and Zimbabwe, who's going to invest in your country, invest in your infrastructure, invest in jobs? And so Bert was about stopping the rot, stabilizing the system, building a platform where people can have credibility in government as a partner, credibility in our currency. And from that platform, we need to empower and to enfranchise our people to be making choices that influence their own fates. That sounds broad, but the plan really is about how we do that and how we spend the money. Spending money on sanitation, airports, transport, that infrastructure is vital. Spending and investing in the social safety net, because we are going to stretch that social safety net. In adjusting our budget, we're going to stretch that social safety net. So we are reinvesting in our welfare payments. We're ring fencing with the help of technical assistance from the IDB and the World Bank and the IMF on ring fencing our social expenditures. But there's no sweet medicine here. There's no getting around the fact that there's going to be pain. There's going to be adjustment. To move from a debt to GDP of near 170% if you include the arrears, to 60% in the long run, a stable, resilient level, a level that will give people confidence, requires running significant surpluses. We're going to have to run a surplus of around 6% of GDP on the primary, so excluding all interest payments. And that is compared to a government that used to run a primary deficit in the region of 4, 5, 6% for 10 years. So that is a significant adjustment. And the only way we could do that, let me end with this, is by, and I think what makes this program fairly unique is the degree to which we have shared the burden. We've shared the burden with creditors. It's almost 50-50. We've shared the burden between taxpayers and expenditure cuts, job losses. We've shared the burden between foreign taxpayers, as Bert was saying, and local taxpayers. And it is only by sharing that burden that we've been able to do a real adjustment, a deep adjustment. If we couldn't share that burden, we couldn't really do this adjustment. But that adjustment brings us back, rescues our dollar, gives us that platform to go for growth, to invest in our people, build their skills, get high-wage jobs, etc.
Thank you, Prof. With respect to your comment on ring fencing of social expenditure, do you have in mind, does the government have in mind a target with respect to any human development indicators or poverty indicators in there that we're tying these expenditures to?
So we thought deeply about that, and the challenge, of course, with some of those indicators is that government alone can't control all of the context of poverty. So we're going to invest in some of the key things. We have 5,000 pit toilets in Barbados, not something to talk about amongst polite company, but a real important symbol of the two Barbadoses that have developed in recent years that we need to bring back to one Barbados. So we're going to ring fence almost $60 million of social expenditure. We're going to make a commitment that our poverty indicators are going in the right direction rather than the wrong direction. But we fear that coming up with a target may not be easy necessarily because there are other factors going on. Let me end by saying that unemployment can be a big contributor to poverty.
Of course.
And so we are very conscious that the public sector is going to shrink. It has to shrink. It's too big, especially in the state-owned enterprises. But we're going to make sure that everyone who is displaced, everyone, will have an offer of either an extensive training program, a 12-month training program. We're investing $30 million into training, or the offer of a job in a digitizing, modernizing program, maybe a program that lasts for 1 or 2 years. For example, we want to digitize all records the government has. So when you go to renew your driving license, Marla, you don't need to wait for 5 hours in the licensing authority because they'll have all your documents digitally proved and with signatures, but for that to happen, we need to input that data. And we also, as you know, are working towards changing preferences in the procurement. Government spends about $400 million a year. We want to earmark around 20% of that for those people who are in some difficulty, who have been displaced from a job or have some disabilities, etc. So we can spend the government's money in a more fair way. And we think that we can basically, therefore, hold the society, make sure we don't break as we go through this tough adjustment.
No, and I appreciate that, and I'm glad to hear that these initiatives, especially the fact that everybody who's let go will have an offer, that's very, very unique and comforting, because as we saw in the Jamaica program, unless you pay close attention to these social outcomes, you can end up, even after all of your economic indicators look very good, the social side can jeopardize, I guess, or still leave a bitter taste in everyone's mouth, I guess, coming out of the adjustment. But hopefully it will go the other way here in Barbados. So now finally, let me turn to Juan Carlos to tell us a little bit about what the IDB's role is in all of this.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Marla, and thank you, Professor Avinash and Bert, for the opportunity. We, from the onset, after the elections and after the first announcements, we have been working closely with the IMF and with the government to understand the challenges. Obviously, we had done a lot of analytical work and we were aware of the situation. And after the announcement of Bert, of the Recovery and Transformation Plan, we had extensive conversation with the government and found that for the most pressing needs in the short run, and for the government has breathing room to make the adjustments, we had the right instrument available, which is a new instrument that the board approved last year. And it's called the Special Development Lending, and it's designed for countries which are going through macro crisis. And it's a single tranche, fully fronted operation. And in the case of Barbados, it amounts to 2% of GDP, so which is around $100 million. And it is budget support. It finances the fiscal deficit, obviously, as a professor mentioned, to curtail the accumulation of arrears and build foreign reserves, which I think will give all the investors and all the parties involved the necessary credibility and patience to go about the potential investments and for the government to go about all the reforms. The SDL is obviously designed to provide macro stability, to create a path for sustainable fiscal situation, and to safeguard social gains, because we believe that it's a package. It should include all the relevant factors that are important for a country that is going through a macro crisis and is willing to invest, make the necessary adjustments, and have a clear path for the future. That's for the short run, and we are expecting our board to consider the operation by mid-November for a disbursement fully right afterwards. That will complement, obviously, the disbursement of the IMF and probably the support also of the CDB, because we believe that it's a burden that has to be shared, and we have been working with all the relevant parties. Also, and I think it's important to mention that we are working on our country strategy that will accompany the country for the next 4 or 5 years. And one pillar definitely will be support for the macro situation, because besides the support for the short run, we believe in a medium and long-term policies that will support a macro stabilization, and obviously to support the social gains. In that regard, one of the pillars will be also social protection. We are still working with the government to define with precision the pillars and the activities that will be supported, and obviously the final decision on how to break down the support will have to be coordinated with all the other parties. And so besides the short-run support and the activities that will come with the country strategy, we'll keep working with our portfolio. That is definitely pro-growth. Actually, we launched just early this morning the first set of public works in road rehabilitation, which is important for supporting the tourism sector and to improve the lives of the population. Because as Professor mentioned, we are in the business of supporting the countries and improving the lives of the population. We cannot forget that besides the numbers and the policy announcements, people are eagerly expecting good news, good possibilities for making their own decisions, and for the investors to go about their business decisions and support the growth of the economy. In that regard, besides our support to all the policy regulations, we definitely believe in the role of the private sector, so we'll support the government in all the necessary regulations to improve the doing business climate and also provide financing for the private sector. Definitely the path ahead needs the collaboration of the public and the private sector, and unlocking all the bottlenecks will facilitate the involvement of the private sector, not only from a regulation point of view, but also with access to finance. So this is the package. It's a short-run support with an instrument, which, by the way, Barbados will be the first country to use it. And
wow.
Yes, a country strategy that will support macro stabilization and safeguarding the social gains, and also an efficient use of our portfolio in sectors like energy, which is definitely important for the productivity of the country in general, and probably specifically for the tourism sector, which is so important for the country, and obviously technical assistance and joint collaboration with our partners.
Great, thanks for sharing that one. So this facility, I just want to be clear that Barbados is the first to access via the IDB. It's called a single tranche loan. Sorry?
It's special development lending.
Special development lending.
Single tranche. Yeah, yes, SDL.
Single
we like
single tranche loan, STL. I like it. Many firsts here. We have a program named after the mission chief. We have a brand new facility from the IDB. And I don't know, I mean, I don't have the data, but I know that, Prof, when we discussed the fact that this program was signed 3.5 months, after 3.5 months of negotiation between the government and the IMF, that sounds like record time to me. I'm not sure Bert may be able to tell us if this is record time indeed, but it certainly sounds like, I can imagine how many sleepless nights people in the government of Barbados, as well as the team from the IMF and the other partners would have had. So certainly, you know, tremendous effort from everyone. And so it's, of course, deserves congratulation and commendation. So I want to turn now to invite questions from our listeners and audience. Melissa will be able to feed us those questions verbally, and just want to make sure to mention to our listeners and participants that sometimes you may not hear specifically your question being asked, but what happens is if we have quite a few people asking similar questions, Melissa does a really good job of sort of summarizing those questions and giving us a chance to respond to many people in one shot. So let's take some questions.
Yeah, let's start off today. If the panel could comment on the impact of the program, the plan, to social safety nets and life as Barbadians have grown accustomed to. What are the adjustments? What adjustments or hardships can they expect?
Good question.
Would you like me to kick off on that?
Of course.
Well, you can imagine it's something that the government of the day thinks and has thought very deeply about. We aren't changing the character of Barbados. Barbados is a country with a substantial degree of high quality public services, good public education, good public health, and we don't want to change that. We want to move back to better public education, better public health. We need to get our fiscal affairs correct to afford those kinds of public services. We have put in place, as I said, a mitigation strategy, a strategy for helping all those whose jobs will be displaced. We have ring-fenced social spending. And our vision of Barbados is one where there are some very strong public services that help to lift up people, in particular education and health, but also telecommunications, broadband, also ports. And so we have tried very hard to certainly make sure that we are not having a damaging impact on the most vulnerable people in our society. We believe the test of a civilization is how it treats the most vulnerable people in our society. And the way we can do that beyond talk is by sharing that burden. If we decided, for example, to have all of the adjustment and expenditure cuts, we would have had a substantial impact on poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And we've decided not to do that. If we had decided to put all the burden into local taxpayers, that would also have crimped the economy, slowed growth, and made it very hard to grow our way out of this problem. And we've decided not to do that. So I would say it's front and frontal in our thinking, is how do we protect the most vulnerable people in our society, and how do we grow our economy? Growth is vital. It is the vital way of dealing with all of these problems. And so we need to make sure we have an environment that supports growth.
And inclusive growth, equitable growth.
Very much so, very much so. I agree.
Bert?
Yes, for the IMF also, social spending to protect the most vulnerable is critically important. Of course, the government takes the lead in designing exactly how that is done. But sort of to underline the importance of it for us also is that the program has a target, a floor on social spending of protected spending. And I think that's very important, because typically when you think about fund programs, you think about, the primary surplus target, international reserves. But this is also a target under the program that we'll be looking at very closely.
Good, thank you. Juan Carlos, you wanted to add anything there?
Well, simply to mention that by design, the SDL wants to safeguard social gains. And by design, we only need one condition, which is the approval of the extended fund facility. But we wanted to endorse one of the conditions or structural measures to have a floor on social spending. So we are adding that to our SDL just to make sure that we have an indicator that shows that we are fully supporting, at least in terms of spending. In terms of our dialogue for the country strategy, social safety net analysis is paramount, and there are different measures that we want to discuss, streamlining some of the programs, maybe trying to gain efficiency in terms of the way they are managed, and try to keep some of the gains that one of the successful programs have achieved in terms of the transition between tertiary education and labor market, trying to bring the labor market as a signal to have a better curricula. So we are definitely in a position to have a discussion on how to streamline the programs to make them more efficient, and obviously to safeguard a reasonable social spending number.
Marla, if I could just add something.
Sure.
to help people think about the framework here. Barbados was a highly indebted country, and therefore we didn't think that a key part of our strategy was to borrow more money to raise our debt. We have to get our fiscal affairs in order, but we need some time to make that adjustment. And if we are going to have a strategy of offering everyone who's displaced with a training program or an alternative job, if we are going to ring fence our social spending, we needed some liquidity. And the IDB and the CDB, a critical role their monies are playing is to enable us to finance those programs from day one, rather than having to wait for the adjustment to be deeper before we can do so.
That's a good strategy, I think. Well done. So can we have another question, Melissa?
Along the lines of reforms, where can we expect the real cuts to government expenditure beyond interest payments, and what control measures are being reviewed to minimize wastage across various sectors within government, and also to improve the collection of outstanding debt owed to government?
Prof, you'll handle that.
So we've gone through one of the most extensive exercises in economic democracy. We launched a survey with 90 questions. It takes on average 45 minutes to fill out that survey. And yet, a big chunk of our population did. Online, over 5,000 people. Offline, in hard copy, many hundreds. And part of the question we ask people is think about your public services, about your state-owned enterprises, which are the most vital, which we cannot do without, which are important but could perhaps be done by other people, and which were not necessary. And so that helped to inform what we're doing on the state-owned enterprises. As Bert mentioned, our biggest expenditure problem is in the state-owned enterprises. And there are reasonable political economy reasons for why that took place. The center actually has a lot of scrutiny over expenditure. The further one goes from the center, through a state-owned enterprise, a board, the harder it is, or has been in the past, to really monitor what's going on. Now, we've had to change that. So today, the Prime Minister of Barbados has a prototype application that we've written on her mobile phone, which tells her all of the money that came in that day and all the money that left. And we are going to be holding state-owned enterprises not to do their accounts within 5 years, which has been the practice, but actually to have a full reconciled account on a monthly basis. So that's one of the ways we're doing control. But we're also shifting things out of government. There's no reason why government should manage the caves of Barbados. The government should own the caves of Barbados, but the management could be done by private people with private incentives. The same with the Kensington Oval management. The same with a number of things which are inherently commercial. So we're going to make sure the government owns the assets, but the management and the service involves the energy of the private sector. And we also, as you know, have a program of economic enfranchisement where we're saying to our sanitation workers and our transport workers that they should form teams. Those teams should bid for work, and that we can help them develop those teams. The government can help them fund the ownership of the buses and the trucks, and that will, in the long run, I think, produce more efficiency. You find when a driver owns their truck, that truck spends a lot less time in the workshop than when someone else does.
Interesting. So a lot more private sector led activity to take place, and this, well, not displace, but replace some of what the public sector was handling. I thought that survey was brilliant. And I'm not surprised that you got the kind of response that you did, and that people were keen to participate in making that decision. I thought that was really brilliant. So congratulations again for that. Does anybody? Yes, Juan Carlos.
Taking advantage of Professor Avinash's comments, I would like to stress the importance of having all the social partnership meetings along the way during the discussions, but mainly to keep that practice, because for an implementation of a program and also to monitor what is going on, keep all the society and private sector involved, informed, and getting a constant feedback is really, really important. So I really want to stress the need to keep the social partnership alive, probably adjust it a little bit, or have a special chapter for monitoring the program.
I agree, and yes, Bert, go right ahead.
So yeah, that's an element of the approach of the new government that we also like very much, the consultative approach. And I just wanted to echo the points that Professor Persaud was making. If you, as an outsider, if you look at the activities that the government of Barbados is undertaking, what strikes you is that it's a very wide range. So it includes a lot of activities that are in other countries are also done by the government, but it also includes a lot of activities that in very few countries are done by the government. So to take a fresh look at what is really key and what is perhaps not so key and can be done by the private sector as well, we think that's critically important. Yeah.
I agree.
Marla,
sorry, go ahead,
it was
Prof.
one of those things that I think characterizes Barbados, that
Yeah.
within 24 hours of the election, the Prime Minister had corralled all of the social partners into a room in the Lloyd Sanderford Conference Center, and they didn't leave till midnight, working out what was the plan going to be. And I remember her saying, leaning over and saying, the degree of commitment that they were going to make. You had the private sector saying, we don't mind paying higher taxes if you're going to rescue this economy. You had the union saying, we understand that there's going to have to be displaced workers, but if you're growing the economy and we can find opportunities for our members, then we understand that and we'll support that. That degree of commitment and unity, I've worked all over the world. That is unique and something very typical and a key characteristic of Barbados. And I think that we say that we are going to arrive together because we actually walked together this journey.
That's a good way of putting it. And I mean, I think it also, draws to mind brings to mind what Jamaica has done coming out of their IMF program. They have their Economic Growth Council, but their EPOC, the Oversight Committee, and these two institutions, bring together players from and stakeholders from different segments of society, private sector, public sector, government, and so on. So, but in a way, Barbados always had this. Perhaps now they have renewed vigor. So it's good to see that has been rejuvenated. Other question?
I'm just going to stay on the topic of Jamaica for a second, because we also know that Bert brings in the experience from Jamaica, and there have been a few questions around, Jamaica's been doing very well under the IMF program, but they still have not had meaningful growth. And so what's being done differently here in Barbados in this time to lead to meaningful growth?
Yeah, that's partly true. Although last week I saw a growth number coming out of Jamaica of 2.2%. So there is some growth happening there now, but it has taken quite a while and longer than was hoped for. I mean, between the two countries there are similarities and differences. So we shouldn't take this comparison too far. A clear similarity, of course, is the very high public debt. At the beginning of the process in Jamaica in 2013, public debt was also around 150% of GDP, and it's now down to close to 100% of GDP. And that makes an enormous difference in terms of the scope that the government have to spend money on what it really wants to spend money on health and education rather than on interest. And also in terms of investor confidence, it makes a big difference. So Jamaica has also seen some new investments coming in the tourism sector and has worked very hard also in improving its business climate. So that's also something where Barbados can take a look at Jamaica and see what can be learned from that. Barbados is, it's quite a bit smaller, quite a bit richer also in terms of per capita income. So I think it might be possible to turn the situation around quicker. And it's very encouraging what we've seen over the last few weeks with a number of somewhat larger players announcing that they're willing to move ahead with new investments like Sandals, for example, but also Hyatt and the new university. And so there's several things that, I mean, that's an advantage of having a small economy, is that when a few large players come in, that can really make a difference, and suddenly you can see the growth number pick up. So I'm optimistic about that.
Yes, Marla, if I were to just add that one of my roles as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on Investment and Finance is looking at the investment picture. And we have a tremendous number of companies who wish to invest in Barbados. I think many of them were deferring that decision to try and see what was going to happen. Were we going to devalue? what was going to happen in the economy. And now we're seeing that pick up. Indeed, we were looking the other day, the amount of real investments that we have in the hotel sector are enough to double our room stock. And so I was pushing the officials to saying, do we need more investments in tourism? Do we need a different type of investments than some of the names, some of the brands that are coming? And they were saying, no, what we need is to make sure that those companies who say they're interested, who are genuine, real, actually come. And so it's the job of government to facilitate and not to get in the way of those things. We have to do our town and country planning, our environmental impact assessment. We have to do these things in a predictable, transparent, timely way that we can really grasp those investments and bring them home because they are there. We don't need to go and find new ones and drum up new business. We have investments. The game is to bring them home.
Agreed. And along those lines, though, in fairness, this was before the change in government. But one of the things that I'm aware that investors were concerned about, apart from the exchange rate itself and the potential for devaluation, which is why a lot of them, as you rightly said, were on hold waiting for the shoe to drop, is the whole idea of the foreign exchange regime, foreign exchange controls. Because, investing in a country and getting returns is one thing. Being able to repatriate profits is another thing. Can you share with us any news, any insights on how that will be managed, if there will be any amendments to the foreign exchange regime and the controls?
Well, of course, the spirit of our existing exchange controls is that if you're a foreign investor and you invest, you can get your returns out. But the nature of exchange controls are such that when the money was leaking out all over, partly because we were effectively printing cash, which caused the reserves to collapse, then the central bank and exchange control officers became much more restrictive. And so investors rightly became concerned that there seemed to be trouble getting their money out. And if there's trouble getting my money out, why am I investing? So now, we, in the long run, wish to move to a world where we can remove our exchange controls. But we know that that requires us to make sure our competitiveness is right and that our reserves have sufficient buffers for the kind of shocks that small countries face. And so let me end by pointing out that one of the benefits of the IMF backing of Bert, of Juan Carlos's backing with the IDB and with the CDB, is that we're probably going to end up with $500 million of new foreign currency coming from the official sector. So in Barbados dollars, our reserves go from around 400 today to around $1.4 billion. And if that helps to catalyze new investments, then, and we're heading towards the $2 billion mark, we will feel more comfortable about further relaxations of our exchange controls.
2 billion US or Bajan?
2 billion Bajan. And I think that we may go back first to the spirit of our exchange controls, which is that people who bring money in can take it out. But people who are bringing money in and to put that money in an investment that's generating foreign exchange, when they take their money out, they're not actually draining the system because they've brought that money and they've created new money. So we need to firstly get back to the spirit of our exchange controls, which is encouraging that investment, and before we can start thinking about dismantling the structure. We are not going to do it in any rushed or rash way. The country is going through a tough adjustment in order to protect our peg. We're not going to endanger the peg.
Gotcha. Anybody else wanted to add anything along those lines?
Yes, I can add to that. I completely agree with everything Professor Persaud said. I mean, the fixed exchange rate regime, we believe, has served Barbados very well. But of course, it can only prosper if it's underpinned by the right fiscal and structural policies. It needs to be underpinned by structural policies to help boost growth, and it needs to be supported by fiscal policies that are tight enough that they instill confidence and they don't require monetary financing, because because monetary financing is not consistent with an exchange rate.
No.
So as long as it's underpinned by the right policies, we think it's a very good tool for Barbados, and we also fully agree with the intention of the government of gradually liberalizing capital controls to make it easier to move money in and out, but that will need to be done in a very cautious and gradual way.
Good. We have other questions?
Yeah, I'd like to turn, I'm getting a lot of questions about the restructuring. So if we could just turn to that for a second and see if we can get some of these questions cleared. People are generally very interested in knowing when is a restructuring agreement with international creditors expected to be ready? Are there any additional details you can provide on the progress of what would be a debt exchange? And what happens if the government doesn't receive the 50 to 70 we talked about?
So, as you know, today is the final day for our domestic debt exchange. It was launched on September 7th. People were given letters about a week later. And we think that we're having good progress with that debt exchange. We'll find out later tonight, over the weekend. The domestic debt in Barbados is about 85% of our total debt. So we are unlike many other countries which have a lot of external debt. Our focus was domestic debt. So really that's the key for us going forward. But we have, in order to spread the burden, to make sure that no one is struggling too much with a single burden, we have also extended our debt restructuring to the external side. The external side is necessarily more complicated, takes longer. We've been in negotiations and talking to our external creditors. We believe there is a pathway towards an adjustment, but we're not there. We're not there yet. We hope to be there in a matter of weeks and months. We don't think it's a long-term debate.
Bert, did you want to add anything there?
No, I have little to add to it. For us, what is very important is an orderly process with good faith discussions, and that's what we're seeing happening both on the domestic and the external side.
I actually have a question. So when everything is done today with respect to the domestic restructure, what kind of reduction in the overall debt to GDP are we expecting?
Well, a significant amount of the debt exchange is offering people a new bond with the same principal, the same face value of the old bond.
So no haircut on principal.
The interest rate will be significantly lower, and so a significant amount of our gains, if you like, in lowering debt to GDP will come about from the low interest payments and running fiscal surpluses. But we are, for example, imposing a significant haircut on the Central Bank of Barbados. There are people who would prefer to have a different kind of bond. I mean, this exchange has been the result of lengthy discussions and our willingness to provide different kinds of instruments for people with different needs. And so there will be a reduction. I don't have the number off the top of my head. It will be a reduction, but I would say a large part of the reduction will be coming later rather than this weekend.
Okay, so a haircut on what central bank holds, roughly 3/4 of their portfolio is government paper. What about the NIS?
The NIS, the biggest challenge, so what we do with every big creditor is we go in and try to understand the situation, and they all are different. If you are a bank, you have primarily short-term paper. If you're an insurer, you have long-term liabilities. You're insuring someone in 20, 30 years' time. So we look at each individual case. So in the case of the NIS, their biggest challenge was that government had stopped paying NIS contributions. Government had stopped paying the rents on NIS buildings. And so we found that we could actually make a significant improvement in the NIS position if we simply paid back some of the arrears that were owing to the NIS, and that we pay promptly all monies going forward. So those are the two things we're going to do. We're paying back the arrears, a significant chunk of them over the next 3 or 4 years, and we are giving them a bond for some of the others, and we're paying promptly all of government contributions. Having done that, there is therefore scope for some reduction in the face value of the debt, and there is a reduction, and we do get so they are making a contribution, but they're getting something that no other creditor's getting, which is these significant cash arrears being paid back.
Okay, sounds good. So hopefully the net effect on the NIS could be positive.
Well, we certainly were not. I mean, there were some creditors, creditors when under pressure begin to break, and they start to say, why don't you deliver a bigger haircut for the NIS, which we said, the NIS has to function, it has to be viable. That if we were to leave a hole in the NIS, all that would happen is Bert would say that we'd have to fill that hole through government tax and expenditures. So there's no sort of hiding government liabilities here. So there is a haircut, but it remains a very viable fund, and no one who receives a contribution from the NIS should have to worry about it.
Okay, good to know. Melissa,
Marla, we have a ton of questions coming in, and I know that this was scheduled for 1 hour, and I know that the panelists, some of them are available to stay until potentially up to 11:30. So I really do appreciate that, and I know everyone on the line does too. I want to turn it over for just a second to Juan Carlos. I've gotten a lot of questions about the special development lending facility he spoke of. It seems that there's a lot of confusion in the audience. So Juan Carlos, if you could spend just a few minutes clarifying exactly what this facility is it a loan facility for the private sector, and some more details about it, like what type of rates is this facility offering, what's the repayment period, and what are the different implications of that? I'm getting a lot of just questions requesting clarification. Thank you.
Well, let's clarify that it's a loan. It's budget support for the government. So we have normally two types of loans: the investment loans, which finance works and services; PBLs, policy-based loans, which are policy-based. It's a budget support, but based on policy reforms. And this special type of loan, special development lending, but it definitely, I really want to clarify, it's a loan for the government, it's for the public sector, it's budget support, it's not earmarked for any specific type of investments. So it's a short-run support, as we have mentioned, to give the government breathing room for implementing the adjustment policies and to build foreign reserves. So that's the purpose, and it was designed specifically for countries which were going through macro crisis and need a short-term injection of foreign resources. It's not for the private sector. Probably I confused some of the people in the audience because I talk about the private sector. We have a different type of possibility, or as we call a window, IDB Invest. We lend to the private sector, but that's a different type of activity, obviously, because we strongly believe that for a sustainable path to growth, there has to be investments from the public and from the private sector. And the financial conditions of the SDL are slightly different to the usual investment loan, probably a little bit less of a grace period, but in general, the financial conditions are reasonable and are designed to help the government in the short run.
Thank you, Bert.
Okay, I'm sorry, did someone else want to add something there?
No. I was just saying thank you to Bert. Sorry, to Juan Carlos. Sorry, Juan Carlos. Sorry.
Oh, okay, I'd like to turn over a little bit to the state of enterprise restructuring plans, and if you could comment on that. I've gotten a lot of questions as to whether or not there's a plan to reduce, eliminate, privatize public sector enterprises, a little bit more on what those plans look like. If I think that Avinash would probably be the best to comment on this. If you could just go ahead and give us some more information on that, and also along those same lines, what public sector layoff plans might look like.
We have examined now over 25 state-owned enterprises and looked very carefully at what they do, whether that what they do is best done by them or best done by others. We have already discussed in the media some things we're looking at. So one of the questions, one of the thought experiments we do is saying that if you were to establish government today, is that something you would do? So for example, the government has its own printery. Is that something you would do? The government has its own broadcasting company. Is that something you would do? With all the modern technologies and the convenience that one has. So the government manages a lot of commercial type things, such as the caves of Barbados, the Kensington cricket ground. And so we believe there is tremendous scope for maintaining the same service, but not doing it within the government. Indeed, perhaps using the opportunity of enfranchising the people who work in that service or other workers elsewhere to get government funds for doing that service. So that is an important part of what we're doing, but every agency is different. It really is a smart individual approach rather than a hatchet job. We're not going around. I was a banker for 4 or 5 banking booms and busts, and in the bust, the boss would come around and say, you've got to eliminate 20% of your team. I mean, that always led to the wrong 20%. It always led to bad decisions. And so we are looking very carefully at what these state-owned enterprises do and whether things can be done better, more efficiently. The BWA, for example, is it clear that it's a very large institution? We spend a lot of money on the BWA. They're spending around $10 million per month. And the question is, are we spending that most effectively? The repair teams that go out to repair water mains, could they be self-employed? Could they own their own trucks, own their own teams? And we think that we're going to be working with the unions on new enfranchisement models, which will, I think, create a lot more efficiency and reduce expenditure. About 2/3 of our adjustment is through expenditure reductions. A large amount of that is through the state-owned enterprises, but not all. For example, we are going to eliminate as much as from almost everywhere except emergency services, overtime payments. The government spends around $10 million a year on overtime payments, and we're going to say for the 4 years of this adjustment, unless it's an emergency service, we are going to put a freeze on that. So we're making savings across the board, but we are focused on the state-owned enterprises.
Great, thanks. We have other questions?
Sure, yes. I want to go back to social safety nets where we started for just a second, because there's a lot of questions coming in about retirees and how they have they've been impacted by lower interest flows, having their interest flows slashed. There's also Professor Persaud also commented about the state of the healthcare system. And so there's just a lot of concern about the hardship that this demographic may be facing right now, and just to understand what's being put in place to make sure that this demographic doesn't become at risk if we could just get some commentary around that, please.
So there's nothing I can say that will that sweet coat what is a painful adjustment for a great many people. And all I can do is assure you that we have thought as deeply and carefully as we can on each runnable segment. So in particular, I remember many long meetings focused on individual pensioners, and they are taking a reduction in the same way that other bondholders are. But we've actually done something special for them in that we have created a bond which starts repaying. So although the interest rates are low after the first year, they actually start getting more cash flow than they were getting before the restructuring. Because we know they own bonds because they need the income to do many necessary important things. Mm-hmm. So that is what we were able to do. Just doing that, I should say, costs us about $27 million a year. So it is, we recognize that there's pain. Everyone is suffering pain. We have increased the non-contributory pension. We have raised welfare payments. We have got the reverse tax credit in place and funding it completely. So there are many other ways in which we're trying to hold people who are vulnerable and slipping through nets. But I wish I could offer something more, but just remember that it's $27 million per year to repay those bonds and to make sure people have the right cash flow. We are doing as much as we can, and I wish we could do more.
Anybody else wanted to add anything around pensions and social spending? Oh,
okay. I've gotten a few questions too about the NIS and the impacts of debt restructuring on the NIS, and if that's something that can be commented on as well. I know it's of interest to the audience.
Well, I think we discussed the NIS, so we've looked very carefully at their cash flow situation, and we found that the thing that was biting the NIS most was the fact that government was not paying its contributions on its rents and on its workers. Imagine the entire public sector workforce, a big part of the NIS membership, and the government was not paying its contributions. And
for
so
they
long?
had. Sorry to interrupt you, Professor, but how long was that going on for? I mean, that these contributions were not being made by central government to the NIS.
The degree of arrears was rolling up for the last 3.5 years, but got more and more intense with each year. So it meant that the NIS fund began paying its contributions to people from its investments, began paying its benefits through selling its investments. So we have completely changed that by firstly running our finance with the help of the fund and the IDB and the CDB. We are now running our finances where we can pay all of those contributions on time. And secondly, we're paying back these arrears. So the NIS is getting a big slug of money, around $461 million, which is going to be paid back over the course of the next 3 or 4 years. And so they are now have been pulled to safety. They can fund their benefits, and they will now be in a long-term pattern. And because we've done that by giving them this cash up front, the actual bonds don't need to have the same face value as their own bonds. So they're making some reduction in the long term in order to get cash up front in the short term.
Okay. Okay.
Marla, I literally have probably 100 questions still coming in. I think that we are getting to the point where everyone would like to hear some final conclusions after this discussion. I know that we had asked the panelists if they were available until 11:30, so we've only got about 15 minutes left. So I think right now it may be best to redirect it to you and to just begin that final discussion.
Okay, sure, I agree. I don't want to keep anyone here too much longer. So in closing, I mean, I just want to, of course, say thank you to Bert, Professor Juan Carlos. I can't thank you enough for joining us for this discussion. From my perspective, what I have seen happen in Barbados since the end of May, is remarkable in terms of obviously how much has been accomplished, how much transformation and how much discussion and goodwill and euphoria and obvious support that has been demonstrated. It really is truly remarkable. I don't think I've ever seen anything like this. So I think Barbados is definitely set up for success with this program, which a lot of which makes sense to me. My concern was always, if you look at and you contrast, and yes, but you know, your point was that there are a lot of differences between Barbados and Jamaica. But one thing that stands out to me is that, you know, you can get all of your macroeconomic data looking just right in terms of fiscal numbers, balance of payments and current account numbers, reserves, interest rates, inflation rates, unemployment rates. All of those can look much better and be trending in the right direction. But unless you have the social outcomes and you meet the social targets that are desirable for your population, you can end up in a situation where there is still disharmony, if you will. And so that's something that I suppose us as economists, we have to always remember, that you don't want the social outcomes or lack thereof to undermine your economic outcomes. So I'm happy to know that in Barbados, that is something that is front and center in terms of the policy shift. I congratulate all of you, the development banks, the IMF, and the government on maintaining that emphasis, because Barbados had always been known for its human development outcomes being the best, if not certainly one of the best in the region, probably outside of Cuba. And so we would not want to see that being eroded. Across the region, we're seeing human development outcomes declining. So we won't want to see that happen in Barbados, especially given this adjustment. So I'm grateful to you for your time and for the effort that you're making for Barbados and for the people of Barbados. If you have any closing statements as well, I would extend that to you now.
Well, I have a few remarks. I would say that one of the characteristics of what's taken place over the past 3 months with the help of Bert and Juan Carlos and the international community is a program that is fairly unique. And I think there are 3 ways of characterizing it. 3 ways of characterizing its uniqueness. Firstly is the degree to which the adjustment, heavy and extensive, is shared. Shared internationally, domestically, debtors, creditors, taxpayers, workers. The degree of that this has been shared, I think is unique and a unique aspect of Barbados. It's happened in part because of greater transparency than we're used to, more engagement and honest discussions with people. The second characteristic is, for want of a better word, a share of the response, the mitigation. We know this is going to be painful. There is no way of doing what we need to do without it causing pain. I'm not a fan of Jane Fonda's no pain, no gain, but given the extent of what we have to do, nobody can imagine that there isn't going to be an adjustment. I remember one of our creditors saying in a degree of sort of frustration that what we were going to do was going to wipe out 1 year's profits. And I remember thinking, if we are making this transformation of this country, we are rescuing it from 10 years, a lost decade of no growth. And if all that happens is you don't make money for 1 year, I don't know whether you know how lucky you are. So this is an adjustment that everyone is experiencing. There's no sweet talking it. There's no sweet medicine here. And so we have to mitigate the impact of this on displaced workers in particular. And we have the most extensive program. Everyone who's displaced has an option, whether it's through training, another job, or some other enfranchisement opportunities. And the final thing I'd say is that we recognize that none of this will work if there's no growth and investment. And that there are many things we can do, in the words of Bert, which doesn't require money, to just change the way you get growth and investment. Today, government, or certainly government in the past, used to frustrate investment rather than facilitate investment in all kinds of ways. We must have proper regulations. We must have proper impact assessments. We must have proper town and country, but it needn't drag on for years upon years with unclear, unpredictable, untransparent rules, which just sends investors away. But finally, growth and investment in the long term requires investing in people, investing in education, in health, investing in their aspirations. And the thing about this program is it ring fences that, it promotes that, it secures that, and enables that.
Thank you, Prof.
Yes. Thanks again for the invitation to participate today. We think at the fund that the new government of Barbados has made a very strong start in trying to turn around a very, very difficult economic situation. It's a start. You know, this is going to be a long process. We're in a very difficult situation, so it will be difficult to keep it up at times, but it is critical to keep it up. In the end, what we also saw in Jamaica is that what it is that makes the government regain its credibility is when it consistently does what it say it will do, it meets all of its targets, and people start recognizing that there is a regime change and things are improving for the better. And like you say, it's critically important also that before too long, people on the ground actually start feeling that things are shifting and that things are improving for the better. So we need to try to get that to that point as soon as possible. Yeah. Thank you.
Agreed.
Well, thank you, all of you. And yeah, we have been here, IDB, for decades, and we are planning to stay much longer. And as always, we want to work on the short term, but also on the medium and long term, because this is going to take, months and a lot of effort. And besides the obvious, supporting macro stability, a sustainable path to the fiscal stability and safeguarding social gains, we cannot forget that we are working for the people. And that comes to what we always repeat, we are here to improve lives. And that comes in different ways, that comes with different options, and we are definitely committed to deploy all the instruments available for the bank to bring all the other parties, because at the end it's a burden sharing situation, and we can use our leverage to convince, to create confidence and trust. And so thank you for the opportunity to really connect with people, and we need to keep doing that because information and communication is paramount for keeping the trust in the population and to really bet in a long-term improvement in their lives.
Indeed. Thank you, Juan Carlos. And just wanting to end by, highlighting what Prof said earlier about development, according to Amartya Sen, being about freedoms, political freedoms and freedoms of opportunity. And I look forward to Barbados, where there is a lot more freedom. And with partners like you all, I think it will be accomplished. Thank you so much again. And thank you to everyone in our audience for staying on and for sending your questions. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.